Hello and welcome. I'm Nick Gibson and I'm joined by Matt Eustace, Data Protection Officer at Amy, to talk about connectivity. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Nick. I'm really glad to be here. I've seen a few of the shows and I'm really glad to be talking to you today.
Thank you. Recent reports show that less than 40% of companies currently use interconnected tools to measure, manage and control data and processes that are key to their business. Why is this and what are these companies missing out on?
Okay, all right, so question of two halves. So on the first side, I think there's a number of factors that influence whether companies think that there's a problem with this and whether they think that they can deal with the problem if they see a problem here. So with an organization looking at connecting information and trying to get some value out of that information, first off, they've got to think that there is an opportunity in the information that they store in the different systems that they've got, and that there's the opportunity specifically is connecting that together and getting some kind of different view from looking at the individual data sets. And it might be that if they do recognize that and they want to pursue the challenge, some of the barriers to doing that are the presence of internal expertise and skills. It can be perceived as a difficult problem, a very technical problem particularly, or that they need to engage a third party to do that or buy a solution to help them with that, which might be very expensive. If you look at the stats about the size of organisations in the UK specifically, I'm going to speak about, I know the different stats around the world. The UK business population is about 5.5 million small organisations. So they're organisations with less than 50 people. And for an organisation like that, they're very, very laser focused on costs. They don't have the sort of scale to get the economies required to have their own internal data engineering capability to be able to approach problems like this. Then you've got the mid-size. So there's only about 36,000 medium-sized organisations. So that's 50 to 250-ish people. And they're in the sort of region where they are able to start thinking about applying internal resources and spare budget to address these kind of problems. You're also starting to get into the world where there aren't individuals within the organization that know everything, which is the case in the smaller organization. They don't necessarily need to connect all the data because it's in their heads and they kind of know it all. Whereas once you get to the medium-sized organization, the larger organization, that's impossible. No one's got a single view of all the data. So it becomes more imperative to join that all together and get a holistic view, and you get more value out of doing that. But you know, at the sort of 50 size organization end of the spectrum, there's less money and opportunity to do that the larger size there is. So that's what I think sort of influences some of the statistics there. The larger organizations, 7,500 of them, they really do. They're the organizations that are really addressing this kind of problem to some extent, greater or lesser at the moment, or at least thinking about it. I think on the smaller organizations front, there's some technical hurdles as to why you might not be doing it as well. So you might have SaaS solutions which are perceived to be quite difficult to get information out of. So HR platforms, finance platforms, those kind of things. How do you get the information out of that and join that up with your own internal data that's stored in, you know, a SQL database or something like that, which is actually quite easy for you to deal with. I think there are risk barriers. So people think about, if I'm going to connect this data together, am I increasing my risk and exposure to processing information in the wrong way, for instance? Also, if they're thinking about engaging with an external party to do this kind of work for them, they might misinterpret the risk and make it quite an expensive procurement process for themselves. What I mean by that is they may think through their own internal risk management processes or engaging with lawyers that actually they're at serious risk by doing this of incurring some kind of penalty from an information commissioner's office, for instance. So to mitigate against that, they put into their contracts or their procurement process requirement for huge insurance or unlimited liability caps, because it's a very difficult world. They're not used to it. They just think, I'm going to blanket cover myself. I'm going to make this this a safety net. And the problem with that, though, is that the smaller, more efficient, more agile vendors who might be able to help you with these kind of problems just can't cope with that kind of liability. They might know that they don't actually have the risk, but they can't really take that risk on and fight their corner if they ever got into that situation where they're being approached for some kind of remediation. So you tend to then get larger organizations applying for the work, and then the costs are very high. So that's a barrier to people procuring. So I think one of the keys in that sort of whole process is really understanding what the risk is, potentially taking some third-party advice from people who are used to doing this kind of thing, who really understand what data processing means and connectivity means and risk in terms of regulation means, and doing things a bit more efficiently. But what are they missing out on? Second part of the question, a lot. So I was talking to a colleague of mine, Jeff Pollard, who's a Formula One fan. Yesterday, actually, this story was relayed to me, and he talks about connected information in terms of F1 data. So if you imagine you've got a spreadsheet in front of you with columns and rows, and it's just got times in it. So 1 minute 10, 1 minute 20, 2 minutes. That doesn't mean anything on its own. So what you need to start to do is label that information by maybe connecting master data. And when you do that, you look at your spreadsheet again, and you've got a column which says the circuit name, Sepang, Shanghai, Silverstone, etc. And then the rows are labeled with the drivers. So all of a sudden, you know that that information relates to fastest lap times. Then you can connect that information to your product design information. So in this case, car design. And you can start to understand how the different teams and their differing car design approaches influence the best lap times available to them at different circuits. And then you can maybe link in historical performance data, the championship information for the last 3 years. And all of a sudden you get a sort of pattern, and you get trends, and you can see how things evolve over time. And that information that you were looking at, which is largely meaningless in the first place, suddenly takes on a whole new meaning. And that sort of connectivity is really what we're talking about here. So for a typical business, what does it mean in real terms? Holistic view of the customer. So if a customer calls in and they're asking a question, you know everything about that customer. You know every interaction you've had with them, every order they've made, every product they've inquired about, every warranty return they've made, etc., etc. Connected data sets let you analyze for risk better. Larger organizations might have to deal with things like sanctioned individuals or companies. They might be interested in fraud analytics on their data. Regulators might be interested in tracing patterns of criminality. Those kind of things, they can all be serviced much better. Those needs can be serviced much better by connected data, sort of adding lots of context in there. In the water industry, there's a sort of move towards what they call systems thinking. And what that basically means is you've got huge networks of sensors out there that tell you what's happening in your water network. They tell you what the groundwater saturation is. They tell you how much water is in a reservoir or a storage point. You've got weather data feeds that tell you what the weather's going to be doing and what it has been doing. You've got meter readings, so you know the demand from your customers. And when you connect all of that together, what you can do is you can analyze over time and look for patterns in how things change and where you've got interruptions to supply. And apart from just doing that trending and understanding what might happen in the future, you can start to respond to it. So the systems thinking part is about linking that source data up to actually open a valve or switch on a pump or whatever it might be to remediate against those issues, which can only be done with connected information from all those different sources and turning that into action. And that sort of leads on to a relatively new field for most organizations, which is digital twinning. So putting a representation of the experiential or physical world into a digital model and playing with that and seeing what happens with it. So, you know, it might be looking at what happens in certain scenarios with your utility network, power demand, tourism, those kind of things, or it might be looking at what influences the perception of your customers about your organization based upon how you interact with them or the service they get from you and those kind of things. So there's a huge amount of value and benefit that can be got out of connected information.
Brilliant. I mean, if there's a very comprehensive answer. You know your onions, as they say in the business.
Yeah,
at the pit face, I mean, you deal with a wide range of organisations, all a number of different levels, and even if you get a buy-in, and people are definitely wanting to make more of the data processes they've got, and to look at the various interconnectivity, and as you say, to make the most of it and create value from the data they've got and the various connections and connectivity they've got. Is it a matter of the barriers, not so much cultural, explaining to people why it's a good thing, but quite often, is it not? It's about legacy issues and trying to make all these things work together. When you're kind of trying to squeeze something new into maybe a 10 or 20-year a platform or system, do you find that integration is still a problem?
Yeah, I think that is partly perception though, because the traditional way of connecting information has been, up until sort of 5-6 years ago, something like that. The data warehouse, the data lake project. So you get all these bits of information from different systems, and you integrate them into one single platform. You feed the data into one platform. You connect it up by transforming it, and that requires a lot of capacity. It requires a lot of engineering. It requires a lot of knowledge about how the information should relate to each other based upon differences in terminology and language, which means that the data must be manipulated before you can link it. One of our customers has a really good example of that. They're an automotive. People refer to their platforms by the common vernacular name that the public use, but also by the code numbers that they use in their manufacturing process. And some of the data is in one format and the other data is in another format. And you have to sort of normalize that and convert it before you can link that information up. But actually, it's an area that we're quite heavily involved with. About 4 or 5 years ago, Gartner created a new Magic Quadrant for the Insight Engine. So that's an area we work in, as I said. And the concept really of the Insight Engine has evolved alongside the concept of data mesh, which is not really about taking the data out of those legacy platforms and putting it into either new platforms or into a big data warehouse, but more about diving into the systems that hold that information and building an abstracted mesh, a model that links all that information together, that uses loads of really clever technology that's now commodity, available off the shelf, so machine learning models to understand what are the key aspects, characteristics of that information, and then finding the same things in another data set, maybe using synonyms or taxonomies or ontologies, and sort of automatically bringing you a network of that information together, and remarkably cheaply comparatively. I mean, you can start to do that kind of thing for information in the order of tens of thousands, if not low hundreds of thousands, versus multi-millions, which is what it may have taken previously. Hundreds of thousands, multi-millions, depending on the kind of scale that you're talking about. But I think that commoditization of really clever tech is changing the market and the possibilities that we've got.
Telecommunications have developed to the point where you can connect almost anything to anything. Many to many, I think is now called. What kind of regulations cover all this connectivity? And frankly, is it easy to comply, given that a lot of these regulations seem to be changing now?
Yeah, I guess it does depend on what industry you're in. There are different regulations that apply based upon the kind of information that you've got. So if you're in telecoms, you've got the privacy regulations, PECA, for instance, which has certain things that it wants to control, and it has certain characteristics about data that it's interested in. So things like location data. So if you try to tie up customer information with location information, which you might want to do for a relatively legitimate or a legitimate interest, you've got to be really careful about the impact of specific regulations on your business. And actually understanding those regulations can be quite hard. So I know, sort of segue topic really, but I know that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK is doing quite a lot of work in helping to make regulation more understandable by breaking it down into bite-sized chunks and allowing you to then query for the regulation paragraphs or sections or clauses that apply to you as an organization. So there are things to come in the future that will help with this. But right now, it's about really understanding those domain-specific regulations. HIPAA in the US, how are you allowed to share health information? Jurisdictional regulations, which control how you can join information up across different jurisdictions, which, think about it, in the UK, we've got Isle of Man, the UK countries, Guernsey, Jersey, they have different regulations about the way they're allowed to share information. So even within the UK, if you take a healthcare record, for instance, and you want a full picture of your healthcare record, getting that information when you might travel across borders can be quite difficult. And then universally, you've got things like GDPR. And in the future, we've got new regulations which are specifically focused at the kind of scenarios we're talking about, connected systems and data, such as the European AI Act. So that's not implemented yet, but it's coming. And that's really focused at the protection of the rights of individuals from things like automated decision-making, obscurity, so not knowing how your data is collected and processed through a connected application with AI and machine learning and things like that being applied to it. Autonomy of systems, making their own decisions without any human intervention, customer trust, the legality of information, protecting fundamental rights and those kind of things. So there's lots of stuff coming. And I think organizations have got to be careful that they don't get left behind by that. So if they are starting to connect information from different systems together and maybe using these commoditized machine learning AI type techniques to manipulate that data, what they really need to be doing now is making sure they can explain the process that information goes through in order to get a decision out of the end that might impact the experience that a customer has. So that will be, what data is coming from where at each interface between each system, what's going to happen to it? Where does it come from? How do you trust it? How is it confirmed to be intact and not sort of corrupted by that process of transfer? Don't get caught out by a customer calling you once the European AI Act is in force and saying, how did you make that decision about me? And not being able to answer them, because that's when the regulators are going to start, jumping on you.
It's a big issue. Time was in the past, things were an awful lot more simple, like the days of TV. There was only 4 channels. Yeah. Everyone complained they wanted more. Now they've got more. They're complaining about different things. And likewise with data, the amount of data and the connections from all these different disparate devices, and the more of these connections, the more regulation and the stricter it's going to be. There's a big job to be had. Finally, if I may ask you, we're talking about interconnectivity. You're a specialist in data governance and privacy, etc. If I can ask, do the benefits of greater interconnectivity outweigh the dangers involved in data security?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is that they have to, and you have to make it so. The benefits that you can get from connecting information far outweigh, in my view, not the risks of it, but the cost of covering those risks, really. So I think that question is about making sure that you've got the right controls and governance in place to enable you to do these things. And I don't think you've really got a choice in this, as we become a more data-focused, internet-based world for pretty much everything, including sort of consumer goods and things like that. I think really to service your markets well, you're going to need to do this, and you're going to need to cover those risks and protect yourself and your customers. Your reputation is a massive part of the world that we live in now, particularly when everything's online and people can talk to each other very easily about their experiences. You've got to protect the reputation that you build up and make sure that you address those risks. So reading the ICO guidelines, great place to understand what they're saying, not the regulation, their guidelines, which tell you how in practice you should be thinking about mitigating those risks. Making sure that you understand governance and you've got C-level buy-in within your organization, that data risk is understood, and they're comfortable with that being part of the project, making sure that risk is covered off, making sure that you've got all the basics covered, access controls and those kind of things, and security awareness training for your staff. Lots of basic stuff that can be done for not too much money that will help you massively improve your risk posture. And I think the benefits, take a water example, and this is might not be word for word exactly right, but one of the situations that we recently went through with a customer was with a utilities customer of ours, was a very strong cold snap, and then we've been through a heat wave this year, and that has obviously affected water supply. So a connected organization, connected data-based organization, they have a customer who's on dialysis. They're in day 20 of a heat wave. They wake up, they turn on the tap, no water comes out, but they expected that because the water company had emailed them 5 days before to tell them that might happen. And while they're thinking about that, they get a knock on the door, they open it, and there's someone with a bottle of water from the water company saying, have this, and there's a Bowser parked at the end of the road you can get your water from, because they knew exactly what was going to happen and where their at-risk customers were. So that's the huge benefit of doing this properly and making sure you're in a position to do it.
Matt, you've given us a lot to think about. I very much appreciate the clarity and the breadth of your experience, and for sharing your insights. A lot to think about, and I know people will take away a lot of what you said, and hopefully, if they're not already doing so, they'll apply it to their own organisation. So I thank you for your time in talking to me, and can I say I wish you and your organisation every success in your future endeavours.
Likewise, and thank you for having me, Nick.